All right, welcome to today's Explainer. So, today we are embarking on a totally spine chilling chronological dive into what is, honestly, one of the most terrifying documented supernatural events in modern history. We're unpacking the fascinating accounts detailed by Cooney Monday, analyzing the infamous 1949 exorcism of Roland Doe. We've taken all those historical details, the bizarre anomalies, and the horrifying escalations, and built a clear visual timeline for you. So get ready, because what we're about to explore literally defies all logic. Now, when most of us think of absolute cinematic terror, we immediately think of that iconic 1973 horror masterpiece, right? But I want you to imagine, just for a second, if the Hollywood horror you know so well wasn't actually fiction at all. What if the source material confirms it was an agonizing, real-life reality for one American family? Okay, let's dive right into this.
Part 1. The Setup, 1949 Maryland.
To really understand how this nightmare unfolded, we have to look at Robbie. He was a 14-year-old boy living with his Aunt Harriet, who actually happened to be a professor of dark studies. Yielding to Robbie's desperate request to contact his deceased parents, Aunt Harriet gifted him a Ouija board. And the historical breakdown notes he started playing with this board literally every single day. What started out as just a grieving kid seeking a bit of comfort quickly spiraled into this isolating obsession that began to change his entire personality. He became, deeply irritable and totally withdrawn.
Then, a massive destabilizing event hits the family. Aunt Harriet unexpectedly passes away. Devastated, Robbie turns all of his obsessive focus onto that Ouija board, desperately trying to summon her back. And according to the source material, this desperate grief actually manifested into 3 terrifyingly real symptoms. First, unexplained scratching noises started echoing from inside the walls of the house. Second, the family began hearing the phantom sounds of a woman crying, which was then followed by this loud, totally unnatural laughter. And finally, the most alarming escalation by far. A senior family member discovered deep, completely unexplained physical scratch marks appearing directly on Robbie's body.
Part 2. The Inciting Incident. Alone in the house. I want you to really put yourself in Robbie's terrifying situation here. It's evening. He's completely isolated in an empty house, and he's trying to contact his recently deceased Aunt Harriet. Initially, there's just silence. But then, absolute auditory dread sets in. The source accounts detail that suddenly the house itself came alive. Every door and window began banging violently. And not just randomly. They slammed in a highly distinct, rhythmic pattern of 3, over and over again. Then, all of a sudden, 2 dark, shadowy figures materialized, rapidly spinning around his room while the lights began violently flickering on and off. In a state of absolute panic, Robbie runs out of his room and rushes over to his aunt's bedroom, desperately calling out for her. When he walks in, he sees a figure sitting right on the bed brushing her unkempt hair. But when the figure turns around, the horror is just unimaginable. The source material describes a rotting, decaying entity sitting exactly where his aunt should be. This woman had pure white eyes, and her deteriorating face was quite literally covered in crawling worms. She just stared at him, stuck out her tongue, and began laughing in a deeply disturbing, completely unnatural way. But the terror absolutely doesn't stop there. Paralyzed by fear, Robbie finally snaps out of his shock and turns to flee the bedroom. But standing directly in his path, completely blocking his only exit, was a towering demonic figure with piercing red eyes and unnaturally long teeth. According to the narrative, Robbie just froze. He was entirely immobilized as the bedroom door mysteriously and forcefully locked itself, trapping him inside with these entities. No way out. So when his family finally returns to the house later that night, they walk into an absolute living nightmare. They find Robbie completely possessed, violently consuming the raw flesh of a dead cat. The moment Robbie locks eyes with his family, his behavior shifts from this animalistic state to just explosive rage. He starts screaming at them in a heavy, unnatural, guttural voice that absolutely did not belong to a 14-year-old boy before suddenly collapsing unconscious. Part 3. The Demonic Possession. By this point, science and psychiatric help had completely failed the family. Left with literally no other options, they bring in 2 Catholic priests. And the sheer chaos of their arrival was instantaneous. The very second they stepped foot inside the house, Robbie's demeanor instantly shifted into violent rage. He began screaming aggressively right at them. For everyone's safety, the family was actually forced to tie Robbie securely to his bed. And as the priests looked on in shock, the boy just laughed maniacally, hurling vile curses and loudly insulting God. Things escalated even further when one of the priests brought out holy water.
The source accounts highlight a visceral, immediate physical reaction. The very moment the holy water touched Robbie, his eyes rolled back until they were pure white, and his face twisted into this grotesque, devilish state. As the priests began their chants, the furniture in the room began violently shaking all on its own. All of this accompanied by Robbie's agonizing, deafening shrieks of pain.
Now, what's really interesting here is that as the exorcism continued without success, the source material notes that Robbie's clothes suddenly began to tear completely on their own. Blood started appearing, and a massive bloody X was suddenly torn deep into the flesh of his chest. Now, to the priests, this wasn't just a random shape. In Latin numerals, an X translates to the number 10.
That bloody X led the priests to a deeply horrifying realization. Robbie's body wasn't just a vessel possessed by a single demon. He was actually occupied by 10 separate demonic spirits. And the sheer power of this multiplied possession became undeniable when, right before their eyes, Robbie's heavy wooden bed literally levitated into the air. The immense danger of the situation forced the priest to immediately halt the exorcism for the day.
Part 4. The Final Deliverance.
The priests returned for one final, desperate attempt to save the boy's soul. Let's rapidly walk through the terrifying sequence of this final day. Minute 1. The priests re-enter the room, only to find the bed completely empty. Minute 2. They look up and find Robbie literally clinging to the ceiling, laughing and speaking fluently in a heavy Latin voice. Hour 1. They somehow manage to get him down, tie him to the bed, and the intense Latin chants and exorcism begin, with Robbie's body stiffening and convulsing in sheer agony. Hour 3. We reach the horrific climax. Robbie begins violently vomiting, ejecting this strange, sticky black liquid from his body. And finally, hour 4. The chaotic energy entirely dissipates, and Robbie falls into a deep, heavy sleep. But honestly, the most baffling part of this whole thing is the aftermath. Despite the intense physical, emotional, and spiritual trauma his body endured for weeks, the accounts confirm that when Robbie woke up the next day, he felt physically weak, but otherwise perfectly normal. And even more shocking, he had absolutely zero memory of the horror. None. He didn't remember the shadows, the voices, the levitation, or the exorcism itself. It was as if his mind had completely wiped the slate clean. Which leaves us with a pretty massive, lingering question. Robbie may have been entirely cured, living the rest of his life free from these entities with absolutely no memory of the events. But what about the people who witnessed the impossible, the family who saw him consume raw flesh, and the priests who watched a boy levitate while bleeding the number 10? Robbie forgot, but will the priests and his family ever truly escape the shadows of those 10 demons? It is a chilling reminder of the lasting, unseen impact of this real-life nightmare. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the unexplained.